political prisoners are not forgotten. Vladimir Kara-Murza said that the worst thing that can happen to a political prisoner is to be forgotten. And we should make sure that they are not forgotten, because they have a purpose they serve outside of being arrested, but once they're arrested, their purpose still exists, and it's incumbent upon us to take it up, to champion their cause, and remind people of the reason why they have been imprisoned and why they put themselves in that position, because of their yearning and desire for freedom for their countries. In Russia, in Belarus, in Myanmar, in China, and other areas, there are thousands of people who are behind bars simply for daring opposing repressive regimes, the ruling party, and being critical of those regimes, and for peacefully rallying their countrymen for their beliefs. Of all the countries that do this, Russia is first and foremost, and they are the principal enemies of the right to assembly and the freedom of speech. Russia is waging a brutal war in Ukraine that has killed children, women and the elderly, sexual violence against women, trying to destroy cultural icons, trying to destroy the entire idea of a country of Ukraine, the existence of a country called Ukraine. Those are crimes against humanity, and they are engaging in committing genocide. That is something we cannot allow to happen, and those people who have been taken prisoner also don't think it should be allowed to happen. Russia has passed laws that allow its law enforcement to arrest Russia simply for discrediting the military and for calling a war, rather than for calling it a specialized military operation. So for speaking the truth in Russia, your liberty is taken from you. And that's horrific. Belarus is not far behind. I have met Lukashenka on several occasions, and he is also a narcissistic individual, a sociopath, who has no concern about what he does to his people, and without his actions, he would not be in power. And he took his opposition and imprisoned them, and he took people that opposed him and took their airplanes down to put them in jail. He is another individual that needs to have worldwide criticism and isolation. Russia and Belarus are both abusers of human rights and injustice, and it's not surprising because the type of individuals that Putin and Lukashenko are. Some of our NATO allies and friends in Europe that imprison their own citizens for civic activism. That's unacceptable. It's not to the extent of Belarus and Russia, but it's still wrong. My job is to collect information on cases of political prisoners throughout the OSCE regions and advocate on their behalf, and ultimately hope to have them released and reconnect with their loved ones and with freedom. We have brought together this distinguished panel here to highlight the urgency of this issue and demand actions, as otherwise innocent people will perish at the hands of dictators and autocrats. I thank you for being here, and I thank you for, hopefully, for listening and spreading the word to people within your spheres of the wrongful imprisonment of the individuals who are represented here by their loved ones and their supporters. So first, I would like to introduce the wife of my friend and freedom's friend, Vladimir Kara-Murza, Miss Eugenia Kara-Murza, and we appreciate your being here and sharing your thoughts.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say how grateful I am to be offered this platform to continue my husband's hugely important advocacy on behalf of political prisoners in Russia and Russian civil society. Vladimir often quotes Professor Erwin Kotler, a towering figure in the struggle for human rights around the world, who said that the worst nightmare for a political prisoner, as the congressman said, is to be forgotten. Well, I am deeply honored to be here today with Congressman Cohen, who has just become the first ever OSCE PA special representative on political prisoners, which means that thousands of oppressed across the OSCE region will now have an advocate, a voice, and will not be forgotten. Thank you very much, Congressman, for accepting this appointment. At the 1987 Vienna meeting of the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the USSR admitted to holding around 200 political prisoners. Today, according to Memorial, one of Russia's most respected human rights NGOs, there are 488 political prisoners in the Russian Federation. This number, according to Memorial itself, is quite conservative because the NGO is using very strict criteria to determine someone a political prisoner, and dozens of cases are still being reviewed. With Russia's longest-serving political prisoner, Alexei Pichugin, still behind bars after 19 years of imprisonment in violation of 2 judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, we thought the situation with human rights in Russia was catastrophic before the full-scale, unprovoked and atrocious invasion of Ukraine. The horrible truth about this war is that it was not unexpected, but came as a result of over 2 decades of impunity that Vladimir Putin has enjoyed while oppressing his own people and conducting his other military campaigns. For years, he's had the opponents of his regime murdered, both in Russia and on foreign soil, and has broken numerous international laws by invading Georgia, annexing Crimea, bombing Syria, all this with no serious repercussions for himself or the regime that he's built. Emboldened by continuous impunity, Vladimir Putin ended up believing that he could get away with pretty much anything. And he launched a full-blown war of aggression against our closest neighbor, killing thousands and displacing millions. The aggression against Ukraine goes hand in hand with a massive-scale repression in Russia. In her Moscow Mechanism report released in Vienna on September the 22nd of this year, OSCE rapporteur Professor Nussberger pointed out that, quote, even though the time frame for the mission was extremely short, the rapporteur was able to collect much more material than could be included in the report. This is due to the enormous dimension of the human rights problems civil society in Russia is facing. According to OVD Info, an independent media project on political persecution in Russia, around 19,000 people have been arrested across the country since February. Protests have never stopped, and detention stories are becoming increasingly horrendous. Russian journalist Maria Ponomarenko, who is facing up to 10 years in prison for a Telegram post about the Russian bombing of a theater in Mariupol, was sent to a psychiatric hospital for a so-called evaluation during which she was tortured and forcibly injected with unknown substances. Thus, we are witnessing the revival of punitive psychiatry that was widely used against Soviet dissidents. This case is awfully reminiscent of those of Natalia Gorbanevska and Viktor Feinberg, 2 of those 7 protesters who went out into the Red Square in 1968 to protest against the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. So they ended up in a psychiatric hospital being treated for insanity, because anyone contradicting the state narrative was then and is being again portrayed as either a criminal or an insane person. Poet and activist Artyom Kamardin was recently beaten and raped with a dumbbell by police officers during his arrest for reciting anti-war poetry at an anti-mobilization event in Moscow. He was denied hospitalization and is now facing a prison term of up to 6 years for, quote, inciting hatred with a threat of violence. While he was being raped, his girlfriend, Alexandra Popova, was being beaten and threatened with a group rape in the next room. Police officers were pulling her hair out and putting super glue on her face. Дарья Иванова, Андрей Пивоваров, Лилия Чанышева, Юрий Дмитриев, Илья Яшин, Alexei Navalny, Alexander Skochilenko, Dmitry Talantov, Victoria Petrova. I could read these names for hours. One of those charged for spreading, as the government calls it, fake news about Putin's war in Ukraine is my husband, Vladimir Karamurza, who refused to be intimidated despite 2 assassination attacks perpetrated by a team of FSB operatives in retaliation for his tireless advocacy for the introduction of personal targeted sanctions against human rights abusers in the Putin regime. The same advocacy for which Boris Nemtsov paid the ultimate price when he was gunned down on Bolshoye-Moskvoretsky Bridge in Moscow in 2015. Since his arrest in early April, Vladimir has been designated as a foreign agent by the Russian authorities and as a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International. My best friend, my partner, the father of my 3 children, is now facing up to 14 years in jail for standing up to the regime of murderers and for believing that our country deserves a better future. As Elie Wiesel said in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, what all these victims need above all is to know that they're not alone, that we're not forgetting them, that when their voices are stifled, we shall lend them ours, that while their freedom depends on ours, the quality of our freedom depends on theirs. Thank you.
Thank you. The next member of our panel who will address you is Nadisa Lushanak, and she is in left Russia wisely. Her father has been imprisoned, and Belarus. I didn't know there was a difference. I thought it was a satellite country. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for such an opportunity to speak on behalf of my father and other Belarusian political prisoners. As of today, 1,324 persons in Belarus are considered political prisoners. Together with unrecognized political prisoners, there are more than 1,600 people in prison, and also more than 11,000 criminal political cases, out of population of 9.5 million in Belarus. Bloggers, businessmen, presidential campaign members, and peaceful protesters are held in prison only because they were not afraid to exercise their rights. The right to participate in peaceful assemblies, to express their opinion, and to be involved in political activities. All segments of the population are repressed, from active participants to those who simply commented and liked posts on social networks. Most of these people were tagged by politically motivated criminal prosecution in connection with the events that took place during and after the presidential election of August 2020. Repressions have continued for the last 2 years. The authorities are destroying everyone they can get their hands on. In general, the trend is over 100 people per month convicted on politically motivated cases. In Belarus, the conflict between the government and civil society is very clearly defined. This is a constant confrontation within the country through ongoing repressions. My father, Vladimir Matskevich, is a Belarusian philosopher and methodologist, founder of the Flying Universities. For many years, he worked on the development of independent thought and education in Belarus. The figure of Vladimir Matskevich is a symbol of modern intellectual and independent Belarus. Back in the 1990s, he began to think Belarus as a self-sufficient, prosperous state. In recent years, he has become one of the staunchest defenders of the country's sovereignty. He was one of the first to draw public attention to the risk of Belarus losing its independence. In 2019, he initiated the Fresh Wind public campaign against deeper integration of Belarus with the Russian Federation. He identified the absorption of Belarus by Russia and the introduction of amendments into the constitution as 2 main dangers for Belarus in the next decade. He has repeatedly written open letters to President Lukashenka, Ministers Shunevich and Mackey. In 2020 and 2029, he has publicly written and spoken daily, offering analysis of political and social topics, as well as criticism and suggestions to active citizens and political leaders. On August 4, 2021, he was arrested and held more than 6 months in jail without charges. In February 2022, he held a dry hunger strike demanding that his case go to trial. In June 2022, he was sentenced to 5 years of reinforced regime prison camp for gross violation of public order, leadership of an extremist formation, and insulting Lukashenko. But in reality, he was imprisoned. It was a real prosecution for the Orwell thought crimes. He continues to work and write in prison. Already 2 books have been written, but we are afraid that these texts may be seized by authorities and lost to the outside world. The topic of political prisoners cannot be considered outside of political disclosure. Political prisoners in Belarus are the only remaining resistance. We can call them political prisoners of war. Of course, our main goal is the release of all political prisoners. But now, it's important to find solution to a number of short-term and immediate goals. There must be a coordinated external pressure on the ruling regime, clear position and demands to the authorities. All people need to be released. But the regime will not release all people at once. It could be a long process like it was in 2019, 2014. This is why it's important to begin the process by releasing at least some significant number of political imprisoned, even if not all. Here, I speak on behalf of the relatives of political prisoners. We have enough will and reason to free the prisoners of conscience. We still need to build a new Belarus and a future democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker will be Sasha Romantsova, who is in Ukraine, and she is the Executive Director of the Center for Civil Liberties.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, my colleagues. Today we speak about person who not ordinary. It's a people who trying to bring democracy values in place where not all authorities want to see them. And mostly they arrested and bring the jails accused like a terrorist, extremists, or spies, activists, because they just want to bring democracy there. We in OSCE place. It's exactly place where all this country eastern from Vienna, where the OSCE main office, they want to be joined to the democracy area. But now they're showing that it's not happened like this. Crimea, it's a place where war against Ukraine started. Russia showing that any international rules are not important for them. And they started not only from land, Crimea, its peninsula, but from people. Now we have 159 person which political persecution by Russia Federation started from moment of occupation. Most of them, it's Crimean Tatarians. Crimean Tatarians, it's population which living in Crimea forever. Only Stalin decide that these people need to be taken out from their native land and bring to Central Asia. These people hold their previous 50 years, just want to back home. That's why they're strong, that's why they're organized, that's why they believe in democracy institution, that's why they have their own formal parliament and government, Kurultai and Menjelis. That's why Russian Federation, first of all, don't like them. All the previous 8 years, we speak about different kind of political persecution. They arrested, forcibly disappeared people from Crimean Tatarians. They cut and shrink its space where you can use Crimean Tatarians language. Children can't find it in the school. Students can't find it in the university. They create discrimination area for people from Crimea Tatarians population to work, to have some house caring, and to live in Crimea, because 250,000 Crimea population Russian don't want to see in Crimea Peninsula. That's why they even never speak about them. When they calculate all the different ethnic groups in so-called Russia Federation territory, they never put their Crimea Tatarians like separate nation. So now we have still, even in Veja 24th of February, not changed this point of view of Russia Federation, because Crimea Tatarian, it's a part of Ukrainian society. So when we speak about 9 years of war, Russian war against Ukrainian, we speak about small war in Crimea against Crimea Tatarians. One of them, it's one form of this, it's give summons to the army, bring Crimea Tatarians people, most of them, it's citizens of Ukraine, to the Russian army. 1,500 summons, they give the population to 250,000 of whole the population. So it's biggest proportion in each region of Russia Federation. I think you heard about this massive mobilization. So it's biggest numerous of such summons. Why so? Now we have 159 cases, people from Crimea, which bring to the Russian army, was killed by Ukrainian army. Not because Ukrainians want this, because Ukrainians need to defend. And what Crimea Tatarians, with a strong tradition of democracy, want to put against this Russian aggression, it's exactly people, courage people. And they bring them to jail. One of them is Nariman Jalal. He is a part of this structure of self-representation of Crimea Tatarians, Midjalis, which Russian Federation accused like terroristic organization. Why? Because you don't like democracy? So when we speak about Crimea, now it's a place where fear for Crimea Tatarians, it's like usual in daily based, happening every day. 5 villages of Crimea Tatarian was destroyed. There living 15,000 Crimea Tatarians. It's a place where Crimea Tatarians just come home and trying to build their usual life. Now they not exist. Their languages not exist in Crimea Tatarian Peninsula. Oh, okay, it's like Freud inside of me told about it. It's Crimea Tatarian Peninsula, Crimea Peninsula. So now we can say only one. All the territory of Ukraine need to be released. All the people which Russia Federation trying to hiding in the huge jail system because of their political motivation, because Russian Federation don't want to destroy democracy values in each territory which they're trying to control. All of this we need to fight, but not only Ukrainian army need to fight for this. Not only courageous people who each of these countries give the voice about no, democracy important for us, but each state here, member state of OSCE, needs to propose to do something actively, start to be leaders, to create mechanism which given justice for such people, which given supporting for such people. One of these, it can be special tribunal against Russian aggression. And there need to be not only war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes against genocide, but crimes of aggression, what exactly Russia Federation doing. Thank you.
Thank you for your work and for your contribution here today. Mr. Mark Bernrich is from America with the Freedom House, and we welcome you.
Thank you, Congressman Cohen. My name is Mark Barrett. I am the Director for Europe and Eurasia Programs at Freedom House. Thank you for convening this very important and urgent event, calling attention to the many political prisoners across the Eurasia region. I'm honored to speak on behalf of Freedom House alongside my esteemed panelists. For those of you who may not know, Freedom House is a US-based non-governmental organization that was founded in 1941 with a mission to support frontline activists in their efforts to defend fundamental rights, advocate for justice, and end impunity. Sadly, the broad decline of the human dimension of security in the OSCE era can no longer be disputed, with the collapse of democracy and rights in countries like Russia and Belarus now directly undermining the security of the entire region. Globally, authoritarian governments are intensifying repression at home, imprisoning human rights defenders, journalists, pro-democracy activists to silence and intimidate those fighting for freedom of expression, press, religion, assembly, and so many more fundamental freedoms. According to the 2021 Freedom in the World report, 83 countries arrested, detained, or imprisoned human rights defenders, journalists, and pro-democracy activists. Our research suggests that the imprisonment of human rights defenders is increasing and that the methods used by authoritarian governments are more sophisticated and varied than ever. Authoritarian regimes are dispensing with the facade of democracy and are pursuing more repressive policies. As a result, from Venezuela to Iran, Zimbabwe to Vietnam, Rwanda to Kazakhstan, there are estimated to be more than 1 million political prisoners worldwide, people detained for trying to have their voices heard and exercise their rights. The Eurasia region is no exception to this growing and alarming trend. Our research from 2021 Freedom in the World reports indicate that 75% of the countries in Eurasia held political prisoners. This is a staggering statistic and underscores the importance of this event today. Looking globally, 91% of countries we rated to be not free had political prisoners, compared to 52% of countries we rated partly free. Building off of what my fellow panelists have shared, I will note that Freedom House is particularly concerned about the detention of Crimean Tatar human rights defender and religious freedom advocate Server Mustafayev. Server's arrest and detention, ruled arbitrary by the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention in 2021, are part of an alarming pattern of politically motivated prosecutions that have been happening since the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. Unfortunately, this trend continues today with more arrests of Crimean Tatar human rights defenders. In addition to this important case that my colleagues on this panel have noted from Belarus, Russia, and the occupied Ukrainian Crimea, I would like to highlight a few other illustrative cases from the broader region. Since June, Turkish authorities have detained 15 Kurdish journalists and 1 media worker in pretrial detention without clarifying why they were arrested. All were questioned about their journalistic activities. In Azerbaijan, a vocal opponent of the government, Hussein Abdullayev, was granted asylum in Germany in 2013 and continued his activism from abroad. While on vacation in Istanbul, he was arrested and handed over to the Azerbaijani officials who forced him on a flight to Baku. He was faced with myriad charges from fraud to illegal extortion to money laundering. Placed in pretrial detention for nearly a year, he was sentenced in October 2019 to 9 years of imprisonment. The United States Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has deemed this imprisonment arbitrary and in violation of international covenants. In Kazakhstan, Serikjan Bilash, an advocate for the release of ethnic Kazakhs detained by China in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, was harassed, forced to sign false statements, and placed under house arrest in Kazakhstan. After being pressured into a plea deal, he was sentenced to 3 months of house arrest in order to refrain from public advocacy for 7 years. Despite signing this plea deal, he has since been regularly harassed by authorities, placed on financial blacklists, and has his bank account frozen. Arbitrary detentions in Kazakhstan, whether it be house arrest or in a detention center, are marred with ambiguous charges, harassment from authorities, and bans on continued activism. The goal is to silence criticism in Kazakhstan, is made clear by the multi-year bans on civic activism and public advocacy placed on human rights defenders. As many have said over the past week here in Warsaw, the threat of violence and imprisonment is intended to stifle any independent political activity or even criticism of authoritarians no longer willing to tolerate the least dissent in an increasing number of countries. The fact that there is a growing number of political prisoners and other victims of repression demonstrates this, as well as the commitment, bravery, and resilience of those not willing to accept this situation. In January 2022, Freedom House launched our Political Prisoners Initiative, a campaign to help free political prisoners around the world and push back on the imprisonment of activists as a tool of repression, taking both systemic and individual approaches. There are 2 main efforts under this initiative. As we speak, Freedom House is compiling a global database, the first of its kind, to document the total number of political prisoners worldwide in every country, which will allow us to collect data necessary to understand the scale of this global problem. The data, along with strategic communications campaigns, will ensure that Freedom House is constantly raising awareness of the plight of detained human rights defenders and pro-democracy activists around the world, and mobilizing governments and international organizations to collaborate and combat the use of imprisonment as a repressive tool. In addition to this global data set, Freedom House will also engage in individual campaigns based on a regionally representative set of cases to tailor each advocacy campaign and provide emergency support for individual political prisoners in coordination with their families and legal counsel. The goal is to free them from detention while supporting their families, as well as to provide post-detention rehabilitation to support formerly detained prisoners so they can resume their important human rights work should they so wish. Many governments and civil society representatives have joined us today at this event. For them, our message is clear. We must all demand the immediate and unconditional release of all political prisoners. We urge governments and civil society to engage in public campaigns to raise awareness of political imprisonment and lobby for their release. We encourage governments to incorporate political prisoner concerns, in addition to broader human rights concerns, into all bilateral and multilateral engagements with perpetrator countries. In all meetings with perpetrator government officials, raise human rights issues and include the names of individual political prisoners. Request information on specific action related to their medical conditions and treatment. This will help them. For countries with donor capacity, we strongly urge the conditioning of foreign assistance and security sector assistance in particular upon the release of political prisoners. Support the families of political prisoners. Families of political prisoners are particularly vulnerable and need our support. We must all support the families, provide with loved ones with financial, legal, and psychosocial support where possible. Support prisoners who've been released. Political prisoners who have been released often face lasting effects from their unjust detention. Just because they have been released does not erase the trauma they have endured. We urge all governments and civil society organizations to consider these lasting effects through longer-term financial, medical, and other psychosocial support. If prisoners seek relocation once they have been released from detention, we also urge additional support in that regard, given the societal taboo that often exists where they were detained and where there can be barriers to employment, often onerous financial burdens, and stigmatization in their communities, in addition to very real personal security risks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before we turn to questions from the audience, I would like to ask Eugenia to express her thoughts on why Vladimir and others who know that their actions can likely and did result in their arrests and deprivation of liberty still feel it incumbent upon them to express those thoughts, and why they would go to such extent to try to change society at home in spite of the damage and danger that they put themselves in. Would you tell us something about Vladimir? Because I talked to him, I asked Hardakovsky about him, and he said his wife can't stop him, I can't stop him, and I thought, well, I can't stop him. Tell us why Vladimir went to Russia.
Well, honestly, I don't try to stop him. I know my husband very well. So what I do is, whenever he ends up in a coma with a multiple organ failure, I go there and fish him out. And I bring him back, and I help him recuperate and relearn how to walk. And then he packs his bags, and he goes back. Vladimir is a Russian politician, and as a Russian politician, he believes that he would not have, this is his opinion, that he would not have the right to call on Russians to continue protesting, to continue resisting, if he himself were somewhere safe. In his opinion, he needed to be there to share the challenges and the risks faced by Russians back home. And you know what, I remember those massive protests, 2019 protests in Russia. They swept the entire countries. Like there were protests in, I think, 124 cities across the country. And it was mostly young people who participated, who went out in the streets to protest. And I remember There were still journalists back then in Russia who could ask questions. Nowadays, this Putin's censorship war has been extremely successful. I actually just recently listened to an interview by Dmitry Muratov, the head of Novaya Gazeta, and he called it the Holocaust of free independent media in Russia. So there's nothing left. But back then, in 2019, there were still journalists who could ask questions of those protesters in the streets. And many of them would say, would respond to the question why they were out in the streets, why they would not just leave the country and continue with their lives somewhere else. They would say, well, I'm a Russian. This is my country. This is where I want to live. This is where I want to build my business, to raise my kids. Why do I need to live? Let those people leave. I'm staying. This is my country. So for Vladimir, I think it's the same principle. This is his country, and he continues times and I mean, 2 poisoning attacks, twice in a coma, twice unable to walk. Twice I had to carry him in my arms for several months after each poisoning because he couldn't walk. I don't know what effect it had on our kids. I think they've been thoroughly traumatized by this. But I think they also have an excellent example of someone who is prepared to risk a lot, to stand up for his principles, to continue for the fight despite all odds. And I think this is great for our kids. This is what I'm telling myself, because I need that. I need to know that they're learning from him, from all the sacrifices that he makes. And to him, it was not even, it was not like he was deciding whether to go back, whether to stay in Russia or not. It was not even a choice. He had to be there. That's it. And I've been married to the guy for 20 years, so I know him pretty well by now. I know there would be no point in trying to stop him. I mean, I know that I'm married to a patriot. A Russian patriot who does not equate the regime to the entire country and who's prepared to fight for a different future for Russia. And he's prepared to risk a lot for that.
Thank you very much. Mark, you gave us some ideas on what people can do here to help. What do you think is the main thing all of these individuals can do and their fellows back home to see to it that political prisoners are not forgotten?
I think bringing it up every time you meet, every time you talk to governments that are perpetrating these massive political prisoners, to make it so it's more costly for them to take the political prisoners than it is for them to release them. I think the problem is silence and being forgotten. And if we can do anything to figure out ways to bring it up all the time, everywhere. I think another thing we can do is to really deal with it systematically. That means funding serious analysis of the problem, collecting good data, paying attention to political prisoners after they're released, to look at it in a holistic picture. I think that would be beneficial.
Thank you. Are there questions from folks here who've joined us? I hope that if there are questions, we'd like to respond to them. If there are not questions, we'd like to urge you to take action. If there are no, excuse me? Somebody way back there in left field. Yes, ma'am. Would you identify yourself and sign in?
Hello, I'm Rachel Frizecki from the U.S. My work is human rights for women dealing with violence. Congressman Cohen, thank you for your question. I look at all of these people from Russia and Ukraine, and I think of Martin Luther King, and I think of Malcolm X, and I think of Maya Angelou, and I see people that want to make a better world with the languages and the cultures they come from. And I uphold it, and I honor it, and I hope everybody in this room takes some action, because we've all got a place to take action here. That's, I think, what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, and I agree with you on the magnitude of the actions of the father, of the husband, of the fellow countryman is comparable, and it needs to be remembered and thought of. I mean, these are patriots, as Eugenia says. Vladimir is a great patriot. Navalny is a great patriot. When he returned to Russia, he knew what he was facing, but he knew the importance of it, and they put themselves beyond their own personal security. These are heroes in our midst that we have a duty to, if we cannot be heroes like them, we can at least support them, and support them in a major way, and I urge you to do it. Are there any other questions or statements that somebody would like to deliver? Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. Sasha, I had a question for you. I think we think about political prisoners as individuals. We talk about them as, and it's 100% correct. But in your statement, what you did is talking about a people, a whole nation, being a political prisoner, being a prisoner of the regime in Kremlin. And the question for you is, now that Russia is occupying temporarily, for sure, to be clear, even more lands in Ukraine, what are some of the lessons that sinister, evil, bad, horrible lessons that they will take from Crimea and may want to apply in these newly occupied, again, temporarily occupied territories where are we going to see the same level and same intensity of political persecution? What are we going to see in these lands?
Thank you for your question. Really need to understand that each practice which Russia Federation, like political persecution, using in Crimea or in occupied territory of Donbass, they bring to the whole the territory. Now it's 20% of territory of Ukraine occupied, sure, temporarily. And our army working to that this time was shorter and shorter. But we see the whole the practice where they do that, they do in Kherson, in Melitopol, in Energodar, in Lugansk, and Donetsk, more villages which they kept. So it's torture, it's forcibly disappeared people, it's totally propaganda with lying and with changes of information, don't give the full information about possibilities, and totally war crimes. If we will speak about Russian policy of how they made war, they do that in Chechnya, they do that in Georgia, they do that in Syria, and they do that in Ukraine. It's totally war crimes. We create coalition of human rights organization in Ukraine. We have more than 29 organizations. We documented war crimes in the whole territory of Ukraine, started from 2014. But now from 24 February, sure, we have much more work, but we have this experience. We take it like a teaching from Balkan countries, from Latin America and other places where it happened before. So now we collect more than 20,000 episodes. And each week we have plus 1,000. General Prosecutor Office of Ukraine have more than 40,000 episodes. And each time when you heard about some releasing villages in Ukraine, that means that new scope of war crimes will be. We will find evidence, we collect testimonies, and we will know more episodes. It's killing, it's attack, it's sexual violence, it's using people like simple civilians, like alive shields. It's bring people from, mostly it's civilians, they take when Russian forces running from some places, that was from Kiev, from Chernigov, from Sumy, from Kharkiv region, now from Lugansk region, same. They bring in the territory of Russia Federation civilians, and we don't have any information about them, but it's thousands of people. And each time, it's happened in Crimea before. All the 8 years before, this evil was not punished there. That's why it's take more territory, more people suffering from this. So all of this scope of war crimes, sure, like it's impossible that any national system of punishment can manage with that. So for us, really important to support us in this, because Ukraine in high technological, high digitalized country, so that's why all what we have, you can see like online. All these war crimes, you don't need like 20 years to collect this evidence. They exist now. So it's like really, like it's a point of our possibilities, and all the Ukrainians feel that we are moment, what happened with us, it's a moment to change all this practice. Like close the eyes if some small war crimes happened because of country have a really good values for us, gas or oil or something more interesting. So it's impossible to choose that little less democracy and much more money can be better for us, like strategical. 130 million Russians near the borders of Ukrainians, we never change it. So it's our neighbors forever, same like Belarusians. We never moved like in Atlantic or Pacific Ocean or something like this. So for us, really important what happened there, because in one moment, all what happened there crossed the borders and coming to our homes. So that's why, for all of us, important to support Ukraine, make justice possible, and third, keep all the people who can bring democracy in this territory, and don't give the possibility Putin bring down Russia to for suicide strategical. So that's task for all of us, because all other countries, same, will have problems if we fail there. Thank you.
Yeah, well, good. We've got some hands. I appreciate that. And if the lady will be first.
Yeah, hello. Thank you so much. My name is Ina, and I run this. I'm from Belarus, and I run the platform Politsek.me, supporting political prisoners. So thank you for the statements and for all the inputs. And I just wanted to share my short comment on. So far, Belarus is still a separate state, and in order to remain one, actually the topic of political prisoners is so highly important to be at the spotlight, because so many people and so many different people, both prominent figures and regular activists who are imprisoned, they influence the society as well, yeah, and their fate is way more important for the Belarusian society than it was before. But still, even though the level of repression is high, anyway, the issue of political prisoners can be really the beginning, or somehow to at least start to resolving this political crisis in order to stay a separate state. Thank you.
Thank you. And I was being facetious when I said I thought Belarus was part of Russia. I mean, Lukashenka has basically given Putin everything. Said, here I am, I'm your puppet. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I will speak in Russian, if I may, because we have, if you have interpretation into Russian, we also have interpretation into English, and I will wait for all of you who need interpretation to put your headsets on. My name is Hasan Babuhanov, and I'm the founder of the political opposition movement in Uzbekistan. And I have a question to Evgenia. Evgenia, I'm absolutely thrilled by what you're saying, and I'm completely in awe of your sacrifice, and I'm completely in awe of the way you support your husband. And well, all husbands actually dream of wives and spouses like you. And probably when you talked to your husband, maybe you can see the future of Russia, because sooner or later Putin's regime will fall and there'll be a new Russia, more democratic. So do you have a vision of it? Will it have the same borders? Will it have a different shape? What's your vision of it?
For this question, I'm not a politician. I'm hardly a public speaker, so I'm not going to give you big programs of tomorrow's Russia. How I see it, and many people like me, millions of Russians see it, well, we just want to live in a democratic country. We want to be able to deal with our own scoundrels, our own criminals, by ourselves. We want to have an independent justice system. We want to have free and fair elections, and we want to have free media. So basically, we want to just be an average democratic country. I mean, the Russian population has not had access to independent TV since 2003. That's when the last independent TV channel was closed down on Putin's orders. Russia has not seen free and fair elections since 2003, because in 2003, that was the last parliamentary election that was considered free but not fair by international organizations. So that's 19 years of propaganda and 19 years of stolen elections. And Vladimir Putin knew what he was doing. You know, back when he came to power, the first thing he did was going after one independent TV channel after another. Created a vacuum, filled it with propaganda, sat back, and waited for it to take root. So we are seeing the results of that now. Since Vladimir has been involved in the advocacy for the introduction of targeted Magnitsky sanctions since 2010, because back then, it was already obvious that there was no rule of law or independent justice system left in Russia. And the idea behind the Magnitsky law, the Magnitsky legislation, was that since we cannot bring to justice those human rights abusers in Russia, maybe we'll seek justice elsewhere. And it is very, I talked about it in my remarks. I said that what we're seeing today in Ukraine, this absolutely atrocious war of aggression, this is a result of over 2 decades of impunity that Vladimir Putin has enjoyed. That is the result of, well, you know, the world kept resetting relations with a dictator. There's no other way to put it. There has been one deal after another, one negotiation after another. People were being beaten to a pulp in the streets of Russian cities. And Western democracies were signing yet another contract, resetting relations, and starting yet another round of that, business as usual, with a dictator. Of course, he ended up believing that he could get away with anything. I mean, in his mind, and it's pretty logical, in his mind, he thinks, well, if I can annex Crimea, why can't I go and annex the rest of Ukraine? If I can bomb civilians in Syria, why can't I do the same in Ukraine? Logical, right? I mean, in his warped mind of a dictator, this is logical. So we need for this to end. And in order for this to happen, there are, I think, 3 key factors that will bring closer the demise of Putin's regime. The first one is Ukraine has to win this war. And Ukraine has to win this war on Ukraine's terms. There can be no more talk about Ukraine donating part of its territory to Putin to appease the dictator. Appeasement of dictators does not work. We've seen it time and again. So Ukraine needs as much weapons as Ukraine needs to win the war, to chase every single Russian soldier from the Ukrainian territory. The second key factor is sanctions. Sanctions are effective. Vladimir has been advocating for the introduction of targeted sanctions because these hit them where it hurts. Putin's oligarchs and Putin's officials have been stealing from Russian taxpayers for over 2 decades, and they have been using Western financial systems, Western banking systems to store that stolen loot. And I mean, they consider this wealth theirs. And they, you know, it never was theirs to begin with. So these assets can be frozen. These assets, this wealth can be used to rebuild Ukraine, because this money was never theirs to begin with. So sanctions do work. And, well, yes, nowadays, targeted sanctions are no longer enough. Had they been introduced 8 years ago, had they been introduced after the annexation of Crimea, they might have been enough. We might not have had what we have today, a full-blown war of aggression in against our closest neighbor. So I believe that back then, many years ago, targeted sanctions might have been enough. Today, more sanctions are needed, sanctions that will cripple Russia's economy, that will prevent it from being able to continue financing the war. I mean, it costs about 500 million euros per day to continue this war. Can you imagine this? All the production of weapons and logistics, all of that. 500 million euros per day to continue the war. That's about as much as the regime is getting from selling oil and gas per day. So all that money from selling oil and gas, you know where it goes? It goes toward continuing the war in Ukraine. This has got to stop. The democratic world cannot depend on Russian oil and gas, on oil and gas coming from dictatorships. Because that brings around this situation where people are weighing the pros and cons and thinking, well, maybe we can sign this deal. Or maybe we can just somehow no, this cannot continue. And the third key factor that I believe would help bring closer the demise of Putin's regime is Russian civil society. It needs support and help. It needs to feel the solidarity of the democratic world that millions of Russians want to be part of. So I urge you, please do not take for granted the results of opinion polls conducted in a totalitarian state by state-controlled pollsters that claim that 80-something% of the Russian population supports the war and supports the regime. This has never been true. I will illustrate, I will explain why. So those Russian pollsters, they say that 81% of the Russian population supports the war. If you go onto the website of Russia's main pollster, you will see that these polls have been conducted by phone. So from a list of phone numbers registered in Russia. So basically, you're not being called by someone on conditions of anonymity. No, the person that calls you, who calls you, knows where you live, knows how many kids you have, knows where your partner works, knows about your mortgage, about your parents, about if you have pets at home. They know everything about you. So they call you and they ask you, do you support the war? Many people might say yes, just to avoid persecution. But what these opinion polls do not show is that, according to sociologists, independent sociologists, about 70 to 75% of those polled refuse to answer the question. So when you're being offered this number of 81%, that's 81% of those 25 to 30% of polled. Can this be considered a representative opinion? Can the Russian people be judged based on that? I don't think this would be fair. So Russian society, Russian civil society does need help. I've told you how many arrests and detentions there have been since the invasion, the full-scale invasion broke out. And we know how many people were forced to leave the country. A countless number of journalists, of human rights activists, all the NGOs like the Memorial Human Rights Center, like OVD-Info, journalists, all major Russian independent media have been closed and journalists were forced to flee the country. Because, well, an imprisoned journalist is not much use, right? A journalist needs to be free to be able to continue their work. So all of these people, they want to continue their very important work. Journalists want to continue producing informational content for the Russian-speaking public. And when they leave the country, they face many difficulties in Western countries. They cannot get a legal status. They cannot find lodgings. They cannot feed their kids. So instead of continuing their important job of being a journalist and providing people with informational content, they're forced to, I don't know, switch to drive Uber just to feed their kids. So they need support. Russian civil society needs to feel solidarity of the Western democratic world in order for a grassroots movement to continue in Russia. And as I said, protests never stopped since February. According to OVD Info, since February there has been only one day when they have not seen anyone, when they don't think that anyone was detained, but Russia is a big country. Just one day since February when no one was detained. So protests continue, and they continue despite all odds, despite all the restrictive measures and absolutely draconian laws used against the people. And people still go out in the streets to protest. So that is the third major key factor that I think would bring closer the demise of Putin's regime, because for as long as he stays in power, wars will not stop. As long as he stays in power, that cancer in the middle of Europe is gonna spread around, and it's contagious, you know. And we've seen that with all these years of impunity. I mean, for corruption to be exported, someone out there needs to be willing to import it, right? And we've been seeing it for years. So this has got to stop. If we want for the war in Ukraine to stop, we need to work toward bringing the regime in Russia down. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've had a very impressive presentation. The lady who brought up Dr. King, yes, at the mountaintop speech, he said, I may not get there with you. He envisioned the possibility of his assassination. But I think of John Lewis, who went on a march for the right to vote, even though he knew the state troopers were going to beat him in the head almost to death, which he did. I think of the student in Tiananmen Square who stood up to the tank for freedom, yet they knew what they were was coming, but they will be remembered forever for what they did, and the people in Hong Kong. And I think of a waitress I met 8 years ago in Minsk, and I asked her, do you want to stay here? And she said, no, I'd like to leave. And she's in prison now. She cannot leave. So as Bobby Kennedy said in a speech at Cape Town University some 50 years or more ago in the 60s, he said, each person, when they take a position about freedom and justice, sends out, even though it may be minor and you may not think this is significant, it sends out a minor ripple of hope, a tiny ripple of hope. And those tiny ripples will come together and force a force that is so great that it can wipe down the mightiest walls of oppression. So I ask you to be a tiny ripple of hope and to do what you can in your groups and in your country to form this ocean of spirit that will come together to wipe out the mightiest voices of oppression and free our political prisoners. Thank you very much.